Hey everyone, I hope you all are doing well. As you can see from my wild disc behind me and all the books on it, kind of feels like it's a way to sum up this point in the semester. So yeah, that's how my semester's going. But yeah, so this week we are delving into some discussions around sexuality and sexual orientation, and yeah, just know there's going to be a lot of key terms in this discussion to unpack. And on the discussion board this week, if anything comes up that you feel like warrants further unpacking or that you just want to pose questions about, of course, always feel free to do that. I know sometimes a lot of the terms and definitions can, yeah, just be a lot to work through. So yeah, let's delve into it and start by thinking about the distinction between sexuality and sexual orientation. So sometimes sexuality and sexual orientation can, be used interchangeably, whereas, sexuality refers to, the sexual behaviors and things that give us pleasure, and it's something that's deeply personal. So, when we think about sexual orientation, we're referring to this as, broadly defined as the persons to whom we're attracted to, romantically, sexually, emotionally. And this can, of course, evolve over time. Two other ideas that tend to be used interchangeably are sexual preference and sexual orientation. So, sexual preference would imply the notion of, an option that can easily be changed, whereas orientation refers to, an inherent aspect of someone's identity. So, the reading even pointed out the sexual orientation key terms and definitions. They note that, when we think about preference, we might think about, choosing an ice cream flavor, whatever it is. Whereas, sexual orientation or, referring to, someone's orientation is something that, is more of a deeply felt sense of who someone is, as opposed to, something that, could be flippantly changed. It's just, referring to it as just a choice. So that is a key aspect to think about in this conversation, how orientation is this, deeply felt inherent sense of someone's identity. So, in the key terms and definitions reading, they also highlight the ways that homosexuality and heterosexuality tends to be understood as a binary. So once again, this concept of a binary coming up, the notion of binary thinking and understanding sexual orientation as having two options. But, we'll investigate this in, challenging that notion of, understanding sexual orientation as a rigid binary, by first thinking about, the history of, homosexuality as a term that's been engaged with. So, the reading points to the ways that the term has been used historically to pathologize diverse sexual orientations, and it's not commonly used by those in the LGBTQ plus community. But thinking about, this general history around homosexuality being used, different medical providers, different mental health professionals as a way to pathologize the experience of having diverse identifications of sexual orientation. So heterosexuality, tends to, be referred to as, these various sets of behaviors and identifications that come with the assumption that, everyone is straight. So, this notion of assuming straightness or assuming heterosexuality is the concept of heteronormativity. So it's all of the ways that, we see, through questions folks ask us growing up, questions that, we find in the workplace, such as, when are you getting married? Or, when we're growing up, like, when are you going to get a boyfriend? If you're, if you identify as a woman, all of those particular questions that contain this, implicit assumption that, everybody is going to come of age as a straight person, so as a heterosexual person. So What's interesting about the term heterosexual is that the prefix hetero actually refers to something different. So literally, it refers to difference. So as opposed to many believing that the prefix refers to the opposite. So in other words, we tend to conceptualize heterosexuality as being this attraction to the opposite sex, whereas the prefix hetero actually challenges that in noting the ways that it refers to just generally something different. So when we see, these notions of heterosexuality being defined as, relationships with the opposite sex, attractions to the opposite sex, and relationships with the opposite sex, we see that notion of binary thinking coming up again. So, we see how heterosexuality is defined in tandem with the reinforcement of binary gender and with binary frameworks around sex and gender. So the notion of heterosexuality tends to assume this notion of there only being two options in relation to who we can have relationships with. So either you're in a relationship with a man or a woman, that you choose whatever is like quote unquote the opposite sex that you are or that you were assigned at birth. But with heterosexuality, it's important to note how it often implies different social trajectories or the assumption of different social trajectories. So, it tends to be associated with this notion of, following a particular path and hitting particular milestones. So, this notion of getting married and then having children, and the choice of what partners you choose to marry, as being from similar cultural backgrounds to similar religious backgrounds, then being monogamous in that relationship. So once again, interesting to think about how the prefix hetero refers to something different, whereas we see the ways that rigid categorization tends to define these different social trajectories. So that notion of this is the way that you go, this is the path that you will follow. But it's important to note with that the ways that diverse heterosexualities take shape. So we could even see this through a married couple that decides to not have children, a couple that comes from different religious backgrounds and whatnot. So all of these different facets that folks may see as oh, it's just different types of relationships and whatnot. It's important to think about that in relation to the ways that social definitions around heterosexuality tend to create these rigid social trajectories, whereas there's so many more relationships even under the umbrella of heterosexuality. There's so many different ways to experience that and define it. So it's not all the same path, same trajectory, around marriage, children, monogamy, etc. So, we're also thinking in this conversation about, how that notion of a binary between heterosexuality and homosexuality was also reinforced by measures such as the Kinsey scale, which was originally called the heterosexual homosexual rating scale. And what that particular measure did the work of doing was thinking about sexual orientation as actually being more fluid than they did expect to, categorize it out of the gate. So, in other words, thinking about folks that went through, experiencing the questions of the Kinsey scale, many folks that may have conceived of themselves on this binary as being heterosexual or homosexual, they were much less rigidly binary gay and straight. So much less rigidly binary, either or, gay or straight, heterosexual or homosexual. The measure showed that there was a lot more more, fluidity there than people had necessarily even accounted for, in their own conceptualizations of self. So the scale did, definitely have limitations, even though it did have this, key impact on, folks' consciousness around the fluidity of sexual orientation and sexuality. Its limitations were very much interconnected with leaving out asexual folks and aromantic folks. So thinking about asexuality, as being those that, don't necessarily desire having sexual relationships, and aromantic or aromanticism as being, not desiring having romantic partnerships, with others. So thinking about the Kinsey scale didn't necessarily, engage with those different experiences or identifications, of asexuality and aromanticism. So asexuality and aromanticism should not also be confused with sexual abstinence or celibacy. So sexual abstinence, would, as many, can infer, many, may already be familiar with that, it's this personal choice to, abstain from having sex. And a celibacy tends to refer to the religious reasons that are connected with abstaining from, having different sexual relations or different, relationships and whatnot. So thinking about, the reading delves into, these concepts of bisexuality and pansexuality as well. So when we think about the concept of bisexuality, we tend to understand it as being a little bit more expansive than, just the rigid categorizations of, binary attractions to, male or female. So, thinking about the reading does delve into how bisexuality can be criticized for simply the prefix implying that, there's only two options for relationships. So, once again, this notion of binary thinking coming up, but, many, may even, know that a lot of folks tend to define bisexuality in more expansive ways, that it's not necessarily, centered around, it's not always centered around an understanding of, rigid categorizations of gender or, sexual orientation and whatnot, but rather it tends to be more closely aligned with the notion of pansexuality, which, is being open to relationships with, all gender identities and sexual orientation. So, it's important to note there's so many key terms obviously coming up in this conversation, yet when we think about terms like bisexuality, when we think about terms like pansexuality, we can understand the ways that they're broadly defined. So, thinking about the ways that pansexuality tends to be broadly defined as, being open to relationships with, diverse gender identities as well as sexual orientations. This can also be personally defined for an individual in very particular ways. So it can sometimes be very, subjective depending on how the individual, defines that term and whatnot, and the experience of that, particular term. So yeah, let's think a little bit more about, this notion of heteronormativity. So the Wade and Furry reading delves into, the ways that heteronormativity, like we had mentioned, it comes with a lot of those assumptions as we're growing up. So the assumption of who we're going to have a relationship with, the assumption of, the different activities we may be engaged with. And we think about the ways that different gender rules and the assumption of straightness or the assumption of heterosexuality get intertwined together. So, we've already talked in this class about the ways that, different traits are encouraged in, particular folks growing up, particular activities are encouraged in us depending on our gender growing up. And, thinking about the ways that this interconnects with assumptions around sexual orientation. So, we see that there's an intimate relationship between the reinforcement of different gender rules and different gender norms and, the different individual and institutional biases that, really center heterosexuality. So thinking about the ways that the assumption of heterosexual identity just pervades our culture in various ways and whatnot. So the concept of heterosexism is interconnected with heteronormativity, and that heterosexism is this societal idea that heterosexuality is the norm. So heterosexism is this more more of a broadly applied concept to the ways that everyday social life tends to center this notion of heterosexuality being the norm. So whether it be through shows like The Bachelor, or various reality TV shows, so different forms of media, through different commercials that we tend to see very frequently, we see the various ways that heterosexuality gets continuously centered as as the norm in various ways. And the ways that it continues to just reinforce the notion of heterosexuality being this universal experience. Whereas through this conversation we see that there's so many various ways to identify one's sexual orientation, and the ways that we can understand sexual orientation as and sexuality as being a profound spectrum. So the notion of homonormativity is also connected to this discussion as well. So homonormativity would refer to minimizing difference by obeying most gender rules aside from heteronormativity. So we saw this in a profound way through the fight for marriage equality. So the fight for marriage equality in the last decade was highly criticized by LGBTQ activists, in various spaces, as creating a hyper focus on assimilating LGBTQ plus couples into a kind of normative heterosexual fold. So, in other words, thinking about how this fight to center marriage, and this fight to win marriage equality, was seen as such a deeply felt struggle for so many that did just want to have wanted the ability to be able to get married. Whereas we saw many activists simultaneously saying all of these resources and all of this attention is going towards essentially wanting LGBTQ plus couples to be seen as normal within the mainstream imagination. So that notion of homonormativity really came to the forefront in a lot of those discussions, because folks were saying that the LGBTQ plus movement was becoming so focused on just convincing mainstream culture that LGBTQ plus couples deserve the same rights, that they're normal and whatnot, and the ways that many saw that as deflecting from various intersectional LGBTQ plus concerns, such as homelessness, such as thinking about, HIV prevention, all of these, various issues that, go beyond just the fight for marriage. But that's a big conversation that we'll definitely be having in the weeks to come, because I'm curious what you all think about generally as we conceptualize marriage and think about, this general fight for, marriage equality, how that, connects to larger social movements, and, what you think about those critiques of creating a hyper focus on marriage, and deflecting and funneling, various resources away from intersectional concerns. So, the reading does emphasize how important it is to, look at the topic of, diverse sexual orientations and sexualities through an intersectional lens by, thinking about, for instance, the Wade and Free reading talks about the ways that homophobia, shows up in various communities of color, and what the experience of navigating different forms of homophobia is like, and how key it is to, center narratives that, do address and, articulate the ways that, that those different forms of homophobia show up, as well as thinking about, the overwhelming whiteness of various LGBTQ plus spaces. So thinking about, the ways that, we see different forms of white supremacy be reinforced within, different queer spaces and whatnot. as well as thinking about, how stereotyping impacts the visibility of different LGBTQ plus, folks of color. So, thinking about, for instance, the example the reading points to around the Cambodian American woman who, felt that she needed to, be more butch and, to, really amplify her butchness in various ways in order to combat stereotypes around Asian women's hyperfemininity. So, thinking about all of these different, dimensions of the conversation and, all of these different, intersectional concerns and intersectional angles of the discussion is key, as we move in to a discussion around it. And I also did want to take a moment to, think about the different reclamation of terms. So, just a moment ago, I used the term queer and, thinking about how, words like gay and words like queer have had historical connotations as, being used to, bully folks, as being, ways to essentially, engage in those different forms of, gender and sexual policing that, we've already talked about a little bit in this class, but the ways that, different LGBTQ plus communities have reclaimed those words as, being, terms of empowerment in various ways is, important to note too. But yeah, I look forward to talking about this with you all. And yeah, of course, if any questions do come up, I know there's been a lot of words thrown at you in this discussion. Feel free to, pose any questions to, unpack these terms more. But yeah, I hope you all have a good week and take care.